Okay, I think you can begin whenever you're ready, Karen.
Okay, thank you, Allison. Welcome, viewers, to a highlight of the Timken collection. As you can see, our wonderful Timken building. We are going to be walking through some of our galleries. My name is Karen Halmerson. I am a Timken docent. We'll begin, our first slide will be the oldest slide in our, our oldest piece in our collection. It's a Magdalene Master and the Unknown Florentine Painter. This is actually a medieval piece. It represents the oldest piece in the collection. It was done about 1310. It is what's called a dossal. A dossal is like a storyboard. It was placed on wood panel and often would be placed in the back of a church. Because there was no printing press at that time, remember the printing press is invented in the 15th century, access to books was very difficult. It was mostly the aristocracy and also the clergy that would have more access to Bibles and things like that. So how do we tell stories from the Bible? For example, the 12 Passions of Christ, but put it on a storyboard. We begin with the Last Supper to the left and go all the way through the crucifixion and the resurrection. Now, stylistically, you can see that it is rather Byzantine in nature, flat. You have a gold background. Two different artists completed this dossal, perhaps at two different times. So the Unknown Florentine Painter, you can see in the center. And Florence and Siena and various cities throughout Italy were known for beautiful religious painting. So the center panel is Madonna and Child. And stylistically, you can see it's different from the Passion. Also, at one point, the crown of the Madonna was encrusted with jewels, which have had been removed. She wears the blue and red garments of the Madonna. She holds a white flower of purity, and she holds a child that almost looks adult-like. Remember, three-dimensionality was evolving at this time, again, medieval, and so we do not see the full realization of the physical form as you do later in the Renaissance. I'm going to go on because we have quite a bit of beautiful work to look at. This Bonaccorso. Bonaccorso was one of the masters of Sienese painting in the time period after the plague decimates Europe. And so it's just a marvel that these artists, like Bonaccorso, who's one of the greatest Sienese artists, could create such a masterpiece. And the Madonna of Humility with St. Catherine, St. Christopher, the Annunciation, and the Crucifixion is an exquisitely done triptych. That is a 3-panel piece. It was actually, it's a very small piece, and so it might have been actually used for travel devotion. We can maybe even think about that because in the lower panel on the right, we have St. Christopher, and he's holding a staff, he's holding the baby Jesus with a globe on his shoulder. And the globe and the way he's standing represents travel. And of course, St. Christopher was the patron saint of travel. Now, let's go back to the center portion of the triptych. Before we go through that, I just want to mention this is gold leaf. It's almost like an aluminum foil that's applied. And then there's gesso, modeled gesso. So it is not a carving at the top of the triptych, it's actually modeled. And if you look at the way it spires up, it harkens to the medieval times where sort of spirituality points up to God. So we have that sort of Gothic pointed spire. Now the center panel, the Madonna, is unusual in the sense that you don't often see the Madonna of Humility. How do we know it's humility? In that she sits on the floor. The rendering is exquisite, the detail, her garments, her face, this little still life at the back of the panel. You can see a little bobbin in a basket, reminding us that she was a domestic in her Passions, for example. She holds the baby Jesus. He has a banderola, which has information. We can't really read that now. Above is the crucifixion. To the left is the angel of the Annunciation, and again, Mary to the right, and then St. Catherine, and she holds the wheel of her martyrdom. She eventually was beheaded in a rather gruesome situation. So we have multiple scenes in this triptych. And again, as I said, it's so delicate, exquisitely rendered, highly detailed, and perhaps meant to be used for travel devotion. Next, I want to go to the Georgian Mother of God. This is 17th century Russian. It was actually at one time, it was the Moscow school that created this icon, but it did originally hang in a church in Novgorod. Novgorod is the center for religious devotion in Russia. Multiple cathedrals and churches in Novgorod, many different styles, and known for quite a bit of devotion. Now, what is an icon? How do we compare an icon to a regular religious painting? Well, this represents Eastern Orthodoxy, in particular, Russian Orthodoxy. These were not meant to be images for decoration or recounting a famous person. This is meant for pure devotion. In fact, we often don't even have the painters' names because they were schools that created these artworks, these icons, and they were passed on from generations. Occasionally you do get the names, but in this case, this was unknown. This is a very large Russian icon. It was made to be part of an iconostasis, which is a large series of panels placed in a Russian Orthodox church. You can see it's the Georgian Mother of God. She gestures to Jesus as the pointer of the way, the leader of the way, and he gestures back with a little piece of wheat, which is meant to remind us of the Eucharist. Now, you can see in her garment the Stella Maris, that was her symbol, and also a beautiful halo. There's little pinpricks that appear in this wooden panel, and actually, when you see it in the museum, there are little holes in the panel to show that it is connected to a larger series of panels. But these little pin dots almost look like an insect might have ravaged the painting, but it really represents the overlay of an oklot. An oklot was a covering to show how important these pieces were and to protect them. And so, as you notice, there are no pinpricks on the body of Mary, but surrounding you see the pinpricks. So the oklot, perhaps made of silver, would have been applied, pushed in, and her face and her body might have been would be appearing, and that of Jesus, but surrounding the icon would be covered to protect it. A very interesting story about this icon. It's rather large, and some of them were very tiny. They were even taken into battle sometimes to protect the fighters. And this was, a very important emblem of worship. Interestingly enough, one of the Putnam sisters, who are great benefactors to the Timken Museum, this is the only piece of the Timken collection that was actually in the home of one of our great benefactors. I believe it was Amy Putnam, had studied Russian history at Stanford University. And so she began acquiring these icons and actually hung them in the library of her home. So I like that little narrative about the collection. So this is 17th century, but you can see the influence of Byzantine art, flat, a little more two-dimensional, very stylized eyes and face. And you have to remember that unlike, for example, what is happening in Italy in the north, in terms of these icons, it was more about the spiritual nature, not necessarily trying to show the full form of the body. But speaking of showing the full form of the body, another 17th century painting, so unlike the icon, but of course both spiritual and beautiful, is our famous Murillo. Murillo was one of the greats of the Spanish Baroque, and he paints a transcendent painting of Christ on the cross. It is an exquisite, what we call Counter-Reformation painting. Well, what do we speak about when we speak about the Counter-Reformation? The Catholic Church had great control of Europe, of the art and literature and thinking, but in the 16th century, we had the advent of Protestant sects, Calvinism, Lutheranism, and they began to challenge the edicts of the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church wasn't too happy about that. And they began to do sort of and I hate to use the term, but it will, propaganda, to try to get people to come back to the spirituality of the Catholic Church. So they often created these exquisite, dramatic paintings to make you literally look in awe and say, wow, maybe this Catholic religion is just really still for me. What is the technique that Murillo uses? Well, it's a very typical Spanish Baroque technique. You see it with Velázquez, you see it with Zurbarán, a contemporary of Murillo, and that is this hyper contrast, this use of chiaroscuro. The light shines on the body of Jesus, and it creates a very stark contrast, very dramatic. One aspect of Baroque painting in Italy and the north, and particularly in Spain, was this use of very drama, high contrast. You see a black background and a very simple outline of the city of Jerusalem. In the back of the painting, we also have the skull and tibia of Adam at the site of the crucifixion. And we have a crucifixion, a cross with three things written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. It's Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And you see that at the very top. What's very interesting about this particular crucifixion is that Jesus looks up and beseeches God. Often, and we even saw that with the dossal, in the crucifixion, Jesus looks down in death. Now, remarkably, there is another similar version of this crucifixion in the Prado Museum today. It's kind of a companion piece, but it is different because Jesus is looking down. Murillo did many, I think something like 11 crucifixions or more for the Catholic Church, very religious artist, and did most of his body work was done for the Catholic Church. So this is our magnificent Murillo crucifixion done in the Spanish Baroque style. So we're going to move backwards in time a little bit. I apologize because I am going through the gallery. This is our Spanish and Italian gallery. And sometimes as we walk around, we come upon the paintings and then we describe them. So this is not chronological, I apologize. But yet we will begin to talk a little bit about the Renaissance in Italy. Bartolomeo Veneto was named after the region of Veneto, which is where Venice is located, and he paints the aristocracy. And this is a portrait of a lady in a green dress. The paintings we saw before, Baroque and medieval, early Renaissance. This is high Renaissance, Italian, done obviously oil on panel, and which many paintings were done at this time. This is a portrait of a lady of the aristocracy. Some people believe that her kind of morose, very pale complexion, morose expression might be that it was completed after her death. So she was a lady in waiting, and he captures her in quite beautiful detail. She, as I say, that pale skin. Some people would say she was actually rather a little bit homely for a lady of the great court, but she wears the finest dress, satin and inlaid and lapis, jewels, very intricate bodice. Her hair is put up in a net that is made of human hair and net and flowers and embroidery, very intricate. She holds gloves, leather or velvet gloves. Some people would say those gloves are just part of her costume. Others attribute that to the fact that the aristocracy often use gloves for the falconeering, a very important entertainment for the aristocracy. Now, there's a funny little comment I like to make, and that is if you look at all the portraits in the Timken, in particular this Veneto, you do not see this beautiful, this aristocrat smiling. Well, why is that? Dental care was very bad at that time. And so you almost never see a wide smile. So we also have a little card in the upper left-hand corner, and that actually indicates the signature of the artist. What's interesting too about this painting, this rich, vibrant colors, the greens, the golds, the very three-dimensional aspect of this painting. He very carefully, the artist renders three-dimensionality on a two-dimensional picture plane. So that shows his technique as an artist. He also mutes the details of the drape behind her. So we really focus our eyes on her face and this three-quarter portrait. So here's an example of portraiture. And I'm going to go on. I believe we have one more portrait, and that is an amazing Botrofio. And this was done a little bit earlier. Botrofio was himself an aristocrat. He did not need to paint. He did it just for the joy of painting. And he paints the portrait of a youth holding an arrow. Now, there's a lot of interesting aspects to this small, very delicate, beautiful painting. And that is that at one time he was attributed to Leonardo da Vinci. We subsequently find that Botrofio was in the studio of Leonardo da Vinci. He did study with Leonardo, but it was actually done by him. Very, very, very few Botrofios are extant today. If you look at the time period, 1500 to 1510, this was done about the same time as Leonardo's masterpiece, the Mona Lisa. And you can actually see some of the facial characteristics, sort of a resemblance in the facial characteristics. And this figure is very androgynous. It's androgynous, but we do think, as I might have mentioned earlier, it is the poet Cassio, again, himself an aristocrat. Well, how do we know this was Cassio? They've done some studies. They're not sure 100%. It could be more of a composite portrait, or it could be his friend, Botrofio's friend Cassio. Now, the interesting element of this painting is we see that he has a fillet of laurel leaves surrounding his forehead, and he also has the tip of an arrow in the lower left. This is representative of the god Apollo, the god of poetry. And so Botrofio shows that Cassio gains inspiration from Apollo. Now, his garments are, again, the garments of an aristocrat. We see a pearl at his neck, and pearls were the bling of that time period. So you often see the aristocrats, the women and men, with pearl brooches, earrings, etc. This painting has been restored somewhat, coming from this time period. It's not unheard of. It is also an oil on panel. So this is a more composite image. Again, although we do have evidence that it was this one poet. Very interesting. This painting was acquired in 1801 by Lord Elgin, famous for the Elgin marbles, which he did have removed from the Parthenon, which is a very conflicting story about a sidebar. Should we keep the Elgin marbles, the marbles, Parthenon marbles in Greece where they are, or back to England? Well, that's for another day, but we'll move on to a cityscape. This wonderful Carnavalis, the Piazzetta at Venice. This is actually the Piazzetta, the small plaza before the grand Piazza San Marco. And this was done by actually an Italian artist, although it does seem reminiscent of a Dutch name. This is a Baroque painting, 17th century, and it's just marvelous. A year ago, almost today, I was in Venice. And as I was in Venice, just before the floods, I kept looking around thinking, how does this match up with our Carnavalis? Does it look reminiscent? Are some of the architectural elements? And basically, it is pretty close. There are some little aspects of change. Now, Carnavalis was a mathematician. That's what he studied. And you can see the use of perspective in detail in this particular painting. The perspective is amazing because it is done from the Grand Canal, sort of shot below, so to speak. And he paints looking up as the fowl market ends at in the afternoon. And you can see the importance of the city of Venice as a trading center during the 17th century. The 17th century in Holland and Spain and Italy were great sites of exploration and travel. And Venice is on the Adriatic. It's about 1,200 kilometers from the Mediterranean, but it would be an outlet to further travel. You see men in very exotic costumes, fezzes and pantaloons and so forth. And that again indicates that this was a time of great travel and importance for Venice. The one thing about Caravaggio's is he predates Canaletto and Guardi, people who are known a little bit later to paint Venice. So he starts this whole idea that the grand tour painting of this beautiful city of Venice. So we can direct our eye to the back of the painting and we see of St. Mark's Cathedral, magnificent medieval cathedral. We also have Theodoric, column of Theodoric on the left. We have the St. Mark's column on the right with the winged lion. We see the Library of San Savino. Missing part of the Campanile, the bell tower, is actually sort of cut off. But it works. It works because if we try to get in the whole Campanile or bell tower, it would just put this whole painting out of perspective. To the right is the Doge's palace. Of course, the Doge was the prince. And today it's a magnificent museum, which I, again, visited about a year ago. So our eye is directed to the back of the painting. There's immense amount of detail in this painting, the colonnades and the arcades and the pilasters and the Corinthian capitals. Everything is hyper detailed, even the figures. It's just a remarkable cityscape that actually incorporates amazing amount of figurative imagery. Again, his mathematical precision, his attention to detail, and the beautiful sky that emerges, a beautiful blue sky and the cumulus clouds. So he captures so many elements of great art. We're going to, I believe, leave the Italian-Spanish gallery, yes. And we're going to go into our French gallery. This is also a Baroque painting. This is by Claude Laurent. And he was named for the region in which he painted. And that is also true, as I mentioned, with the Veneta, with that portrait of a young lady. This is a pastoral landscape. And the thing about Laurent is he was fascinated by light and science and capturing nature in its full glory. And what we have here is kind of what's called a composite landscape in the style of Arcadian imagery. Now, the idea of an Arcadian landscape harkens from the Greeks. And it was this idea of pastoral beauty, almost like heaven, where everything is calm and moderate and quiet. And Laurent captures this beautifully. We see a very quiet scene of a shepherd having his feet washed by a young lady to the left. We see herders with their dogs walking across a quiet stream with the herd of cattle. We have these magnificent ruins on either side of the painting. Up to the right, we have a castle. And to the left, we actually have like a citadel, more multiple ruins. And then, of course, these exquisite clouds and finally, detailed trees. Laurent was so interested in light that he would often lie on his back for hours and hours and watch the evolution of light and how it impacted the sky and the trees and the shadows. And you get this real sense of calmness and beauty. You can see why Laurent was very influential to the 19th century Barbizon painters and also later to the Impressionist painters. He was interested in Dutch too. He looked at some of the Dutch contemporaries who painted landscapes at this time. And now we're going to move to, we're going to go to the late Baroque or early Rococo. Now, this is particularly interesting, a portrait, La Givier, of Monsieur Claude Pupil. And this is an actual portrait of a person of great stature who lived at this time period. And Monsieur Pupil was a judge. And you can see that his attributes or items that would sort of suggest who he is. He holds a law book. You see a library with untitled or hard to read titles on the books. He wears the clothing of his important position. At this time, Monsieur Pupil was given a judgeship in the town of Léon, France, and one other place, I can't recall. And so he was very important. He wanted to honor himself. Now, he was a member of the haute bourgeoisie, sort of like the aristocracy, except he was a working member of the aristocracy. So the high aristocracy, which we're going to see in just a moment, didn't really work, but he did have an important position. Now, Ladouceur captures beautifully in this three-quarter portrait the importance of the man, his ermine cloak, satin and ermine, the flow of the robes. He holds his gloves. He looks at us with very directly and with great sophistication, and also, you know, he thinks very highly of himself, which is just fun. And then you have a very detailed tables and shelves and drapes. So how is this different from the Rococo that sort of succeeds it? And although the time period would see the Rococo, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that in just a second, it's the colors, the rich colors, and the way the portrait is painted, the colors resonate. And so we would attribute this stylistically a little bit more to the late Baroque. Now, before we move on to the Rococo, we're going to look at his wife, this exquisite portrait of his wife, Madame de Sèvres. The colors here resonate even more than maybe that of her husband's. What's so unique about what the Timken provides for its viewers is that we have a pair, and that is very unusual that we actually have the husband and wife. Normally one goes to one museum, one goes to another, but here we have the pair, and that's quite remarkable. And of course, she is a woman of great stature. This is an oil on canvas. Canvases used much more at this time. And we see her in her full regalia, almost a full portrait. And she has an exquisite satin dress, an ermine trimmed cloak, and so interesting, the flowers. Now, I attended a very wonderful lecture at the Timken, and I hope to attend many more when the Timken reopens, but they had an expert in jewelry who studied the Renaissance and the Baroque and the Rococo and how jewelry evolved during that time. And what she points out is something I'm going to suggest to you, that here's this, you know, upper bourgeois woman, lots of resources, and she has mostly flowers to decorate her dress and her hair. And that's because about this time period, flowers became sort of de rigueur in terms of embellishment. They were a little tired of all the jewelry. So what better thing to do, but let's just start using flowers. Although, as I mentioned earlier, the pearls, she does have the pearls at the top of the bodice and then also in her hair. Speaking of the bodice, it kind of reminiscent of a Roman armor. And why is that? Well, at this time, you know, travel had been very evolved, and also the study of Greco-Roman history. And so a lot of the upper class women liked to dress up in costumes, and they would frequently wear things like armor, turbans. And this is probably made out of a treated leather, so it's not exactly metal bodice. That would be probably rather uncomfortable. The other thing that you can notice in the painting is her very, very white skin. And this was a compound that was made of lead, and it was applied to the skin of these women. Why? Well, it hid a lot of imperfections, and it also made them feel younger, that they looked better. And there was a compound, I believe it's called ceruse, Ceruse, and that was the compound used. Unfortunately, that compound was toxic and often led to early death. Before we move on, I also want to point out that she holds a book of drinking songs because these women like to entertain. And also she has a harpsichord with painted embellishment. Again, the damask wallpaper, the highly detailed carved chair, the exquisite flowing robes. You can see that he was a master portrait painter. In fact, at this time, he was the most successful and most important portrait painter of France. And anybody who got their portrait done was a very special and important individual. Again, photography is not invented until about slightly less than 100 years later. And so how do you capture the essence of your importance, but have the most famous portrait painter of France at that time depict you? So we're going to move on to really the Rococo. And the Rococo really, it's in Germany, mostly in architecture. It's very prominent in France. And Francois Boucher was a very important artist of the 18th century. He was the darling of Madame Pompadour. And Madame Pompadour was the mistress of Louis XV, who was married to Marie Antoinette. And they were the aristocracy at the decline, meaning, you know, a couple decades later, we have the 2.5 decades later, we have the French Revolution. But this was depicting the aristocracy at play, lovers in a park. This is a large canvas. In fact, it's the largest painting we have in our collection. It was meant to probably hang in a theater or an opera house, and it was shown at part of one series of seasons of the year. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the color stylistically, but I want to point out something that I find quite interesting in this painting. As I said, it's the largest painting. It was not meant to be looked up at a close distance. It was meant to hang at the back of a theater. And for this reason, I'm going to point out a little bit of interesting elements to the painting. In the foreground, you have the young man as he stares at the shepherdess, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But if you look closely, the legs are almost, the serpentine's legs do not seem to match the trunk of the body. Another point to look at is his mistress, if she's beautifully rendered, but if she were to stand, she'd probably be about 6'5". And lastly, if you look at the shepherdess, who's really not a shepherdess, she's actually an aristocrat in costume, she walks along a path that doesn't really seem to exist. Now, was it that Boucher was not a great draftsman? On the contrary, he was a marvelous draftsman, but because of the height and the location of this painting probably was placed, it was immaterial if these things existed. But I just wanted to point them out because I always found that quite fascinating. Okay, so let's look at Lovers in a Park. As you know, if you've ever visited Versailles and some of these beautiful gardens of the aristocrats, these are marvelous, beautiful gardens, and the aristocrats, they didn't really work. So what do? You frolic in the garden, you play cards, you drink, you have parties, and so they had a lot of leisure time. What is so ironic about this painting is that as the young man holds about the garland of flowers, he's looking on to the shepherdess, as again, I said, another aristocrat. And so, I wonder how, let's put it, what his fidelity is to his mistress. And this is my supposition, but in the foreground of the painting, you see the little lap dog. Now, the French aristocrats often had lap dogs. That was sort of part of their, their home. But it also, I think, it's also kind of a sardonic reference to fidelity. And often, if you look at art through the ages, particularly Jan van Eyck's portrait of Arnolfini, magnificent marriage portrait, there is a dog at the feet of the married couple. And that was meant to hearken to fidelity. In the old days, they used to call dogs Fido often. And of course, so maybe that's a mocking reference to how closely this young man is attentive to his mistress. Now, in the upper middle ground of the painting, we have the putti, sort of looking down the cherubs, and often Greco-Roman figures were placed in these gardens. And to the left, in the lower left-hand corner, we have a dovecote. And again, this is where doves would be placed. And again, for the enjoyment of the aristocrats. Let's look at the palette. If you looked at the La Gillier, I'm gonna go back for just a moment. The colors are richer, deeper, more resonant. That is, again, more Baroque in style. And the, this Rococo painting is what we call more pastel. It's the candy box colors. And also the landscape is idealized. It's something we, again, would see perhaps in these Arcadian landscapes, as I mentioned with Claude Lorrain. So we have a marvelous, large, a portrait of an aristocrat by Boucher, the darling of the French aristocracy. Now, huge comparison is this magnificent Rembrandt, the St. Bartholomew. This was a Baroque painting, unlike the Rococo, and it represents a society quite different than the French aristocracy. The Dutch culture at this time, during the 17th century, was very middle class. The Dutch were great traders. They were interested in science and nature. They often had paintings for their homes. But this one is a religious painting. And Rembrandt was probably the master of the Dutch 17th century. He represents an artist who's interested in the Protestant religion, because if you are interested in Dutch and Flemish art as I am, you know that in the 16th century, there began to be a bifurcation of Protestant and Catholic sects. And by about 1607, the countries were separated, and Holland to the north and Belgium to the south. Belgium remained at this time under the Habsburg, Spanish Catholic Habsburgs, and the Dutch broke away and became the Protestant church. The Protestant church, quite different in imagery and subject matter. So what does Rembrandt depict in this magnificent painting? Again, it's a religious painting. He did history paintings, he did landscapes, still life, and portraitures. He was a very successful artist at this time, except I will speak a little bit about what happened to him. Now, who was St. Bartholomew? He was one of the 12 apostles. He was martyred for his beliefs, and he actually, it shows he was martyred by being flayed alive, and he holds that knife. At one point, one of the owners of this painting was a little offended, I guess, by the use of a knife, and it was painted over, and a book was placed in the hands of St. Bartholomew. Well, subsequently, they realized that it was really not true to this painting. What style does Rembrandt use? Well, this remarkable use of, again, chiaroscuro, which we saw in Esteban Murillo. Chiaroscuro, this hyper intensity of light as it shines on the face of St. Bartholomew. We were captivated by this beautiful rendition of a man in crisis, or at least in contemplation. He's contemplating very deep and important thoughts. He looks to be in consternation. And I want to also connect something about this painting to the life of Rembrandt. Rembrandt was a very successful artist at one point. He was from Leiden, and he moved to Amsterdam, and he married and met his wife and married Saskia. Saskia was the love of his life, and she was also very generous to Rembrandt. She helped set up a beautiful studio in Amsterdam that many of you have probably visited, as I have. And they had a wonderful art school. He had many, many commissions. He was very successful, and he's a very prolific painter. He did etchings and drawings and paintings. However, very sadly, about 10 to 15 years, I believe it was 15 years before this painting was done, his wife died in childbirth, giving birth to Titus. And she probably died of either scarlet fever or plague. And so he was left to raise his son with the help of a governess. And he was very bereft. And also, fast forward about 10 years, in 1656, he begins to go through bankruptcy. How come? Well, part of it is his sadness over the loss of his wife and her important influence on his life, but also he spent rather ostentatiously, rather lavishly, a little bit out of control, and that began to ruin his financial status. And perhaps when this was done, because again, a year before he was going through bankruptcy, he infuses St. Bartholomew with maybe some of his own trials and tribulations. Now, just quickly, this is the jewel of our collection, so I just want to make a few more points. Look at the gestural quality of this Rembrandt. It's very monochromatic, meaning a limited palette. It's very dark. It resonates with beauty. He does a lot of gestures. Actually, the hand is almost unfinished. And so he really looks forward to what happens later in the 19th century, where artists begin to use a more gestural or painterly brushstroke rather than a tight sort of classical Renaissance brushstroke. Okay, I think we have time for one or two more paintings. I do want to compare him to Peter Paul Rubens. Rubens lived a little earlier than Rembrandt, but he was a contemporary, so there was an overlap. And who was Rubens? Well, he represents sort of the yin and yang of these two great masters. Rubens was sort of the top of the heap for the Flemish, Belgian Catholic country, and Rembrandt was the top of the heap, the creme de la creme of the Dutch Protestant art. And who was Rubens? Rubens was a very successful, very wealthy, rather aristocratic artist. He maintained a very large studio and many people working for him. Probably his most famous student was was Anthony Van Dyck, who we have a magnificent Van Dyck in our collection. You will see on another lecture. And here he paints what is called the trony. Now, a trony would be a stock painting of a young man in armor that would be used within the confines of the studio of Rubens, because again, he had many people working for him, and they might want to pull an image like this and probably place it maybe in a larger historic painting. Some people would say this is a painting of the Duke of Mantua, because Rubens was connected to the court of Italy, the Medicis in particular, and he knew many of these high-born Italian and French aristocrats. In fact, he was so skilled at languages and being among the aristocratic set that he actually spied for them. But let's go back to the painting. So again, some people suppose it's the Duke of Mantua, but probably it is a trony. It's more of a stock image. And we have a very Baroque rendition of a young man. He looks at us directly. He's handsome. He's got the swirling curls. Rubens is very skilled at painting the kind of Baroque sash. Why I say Baroque sash? Because of vibrant colors. Many Baroque paintings had a lot of things on the diagonal, whereas in the Renaissance we have more of a geometric classical formation. This Baroque is more dramatic, a little looser brushstroke, and again on the diagonal. And look at the hyper detail of the armor. It's exquisitely rendered, very three-dimensional. He doesn't spend much time detailing the background. It's a little swirling brushstroke. So it lets our eye focus on this handsome young man in armor. And just really quickly, the technique he uses is so skilled. He did very large historical paintings, as did Rembrandt. He also had a very successful marriage to Isabella Brandt. And so there is a lot of parallel in these two artists. Now I see that 45 minutes is up, and I believe that we will now end the talk, and I look forward to having you come visit another time. If you have any questions, are there any questions, Allison?
Yeah, thank you so much, Karen. So my name is Allison. I'm a member of the education department here. So we had a question from Kathy, who asked, in the early paintings, why are the heads usually tilted to one side? So I think like in the Georgian Mother of God, you know, she kind of has like an unnatural
Oh, that's such a good question, and thank you. I'm so sorry. I forgot to introduce Allison, who has a master's in art history, and we both attended UCLA, obviously not at the same time, and I've just been reminiscing about our school experiences, and Allison's been just most helpful to having these lectures come about. The tilting of the Georgian Mother was because she was looking at Jesus as the pointer of the way. She was kind of nodding her head in her hand to pointing to Jesus. So that is very intentional in that particular painting. Perhaps in other paintings, it might be more just the sort of stylistic, but in the icons, it was definitely intentional.
Great.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, we'll see if she follows up. Yeah, so we have a couple more minutes. If anyone does want to unmute themselves and ask a question, you can do that now. And also a shout out to the people watching on Facebook. If you have any questions there, you can put them in the chat and we'll get to them as well. I have a question of my own. I can go first.
Oh yes.
Yeah. So I love the tour, and I love that big one of the Venetian Palazzo.
Oh, isn't that a marvel?
Yeah. Where would that have hung originally? Because I think it said something like 76 inches. It was, you know, it's a pretty big painting.
That's a great question. I cannot answer that. Maybe Jim, who's can answer that question, who's also a docent with me. I don't know. That is a great question. Probably, however, I might venture to say, because it was Italian, it could have been put in a large palace, because just as you say, and you've seen it many times, it's huge. It's a huge painting, very horizontal, but probably in a large home. As I mentioned, the Boucher was meant to be in a large opera house. Mm-hmm. The Murillo in a church for viewing. So that's all I can probably surmise from that, that it was probably for a very large home, palazzo sort of thing.
Yeah, yeah, because it's hard to get the scale of it on a PowerPoint. You know, I wish we were in the museum because it's so much larger. Yeah, when you're
Oh, that's a
in
great question. I'm gonna
yeah,
have to look that up though. Or
yeah,
maybe you probably tell me.
yeah. I can look it up too. Anyone else have any questions from the audience or anyone? No. All right. Well, thank you
Okay.
so much, Karen.
Well, please join us again. Thank you, Allison. As always, you're most helpful in this situation. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.